As we reviewed last week, there's a history of methods from grammar translation to the more popular communicative methods. Today we're going to look more closely at the various methods. Your teaching style will inform the methods, approaches, procedures, and techniques that you'll be using. They can't really be explicitly prescribed. Each teacher, set of learners, and context will require the instructor to consider how best to help the learners learn and practice the target language. So if you imagine a class that you taught in the past, or imagine a class that you want to teach, and think about the questions that I've posed, as you begin to answer these questions, you'll begin to develop a sense of your own teaching style and the techniques that you use to teach well. This will be different for each teacher and each classroom, but some things, as you'll see as we study methods, will come into every single classroom. Regardless of your teaching style, methods have been informed by the past. And so early on in the 19th century, you have grammar translation and immersion methods. So some people would just go to France and live and learn French. Or some people would stay in England and just translate from English to French, back and forth all the time, long text. And that would mean that they understood or knew French. The other thing that happened is that people immigrated, or they had to go to another country and they just learned languages in that setting to the level that they needed to. So we know that from the history of time, we've been learning languages. But the two main methods were grammar translation and audiolingual. Audiolingual was a reaction to grammar translation. In the grammar translation classroom, you basically didn't really even have to speak the L2 that you were teaching. The teacher just simply said, here's a list of words, translate them, and then you would write those words down in another language. Or here's a list of sentences, translate them, and then they would translate them. So you could go into the classroom and barely even recognize that it was a language classroom. The reaction was the audiolingual method, and in this you knew what was happening, but it was purely parenting. The teacher would speak and the students would repeat, and accuracy was key. So more recently, research in L2 learning and understanding is that when we learn another language, it's not like when we learn our first language. Okay, so we know now that, for instance, when we learn our first language, we do not simply copy and parrot or memorize forms. There's actually a whole process going on in the head of the learner. So, for instance, a child might say new words that they've just made up. Like they'll see a bird that's hopping around and they'll call it a hop bird because that's what they perceive and they see, and they put two words together that they know. Also, they learn forms and grammar on their own. In Harmer, he uses the example of the misuse of verb forms in native English-speaking children. When a child says, I ate it all, proudly, the child has formed that structure by understanding rules in language structure and applying a rule that usually works. Usually, you can add ed to the end of a verb. But in the case of aided, we prefer to say, I ate it all. So even if the mother or father corrected the child and said, oh, you ate it all, that child will not change that form until that speech production is formed in their own mind. And it could take another 6 months or so for them to actually correct that. The message is understood. So even if the parent corrects, the child's going to go on, understanding that that's what you do in English. So when we think about structure and language in L1 learning, we even realized that not even an L1 learner is just memorizing forms and parroting structure. So then this came into the L2 classroom. And what they realized in the L2 classroom is that much of what we already know about language is what informs us of how we learn our L2. So it's very important that you take into account the L1 of your students and what they already know about the world and what they already have in their mind, and you use that to help them form meaning and understanding in the new language. So we're actually relying on the L1 to help produce the L2. And they're both working together, not against each other necessarily. They're actually helping. So that is why we have changed our forms of learning from the grammar translation, the audiolingual, and the other methods. The other thing is that we understood input plus one, which is the idea that language had to be at a certain level You couldn't just have people translating large, extensive texts and have them have understanding. They might be able to translate, but that doesn't mean they understand the text. And then another thing that we discovered is that people actually use language for a purpose, which is to communicate meaningful utterances to one another. So we did change our understanding of how we teach. We'll look at that in a little bit more closely. So as researchers like Krashen and Chomsky realized that there's this grammar format and there's this leveling format, other people also were noticing things that happened. For example, they definitely noticed that research found that L2 learners are going through stages of learning. So there's a silent period, the speech emergence, and then much later on, fluency, approximately 5 years later. And all learners were progressing stage by stage at different rates due to all these different factors, including how much time they spent practicing, how much exposure they had to the L2, how motivated they were, and various other factors that were impacting the process of L2 growth. Many of these things are out of our control even as teachers. The language we teach is not always caught by the learner. So you could be teaching a direct form and covering that form and repeating that form and thinking that they're going to write their next paper and you'll see that they did it correctly and they will not. And that has nothing to do with your teaching or the learner's learning. It has something to do with the syllabus that's in their own head. We call that the internal syllabus. So I can teach a whole class verb forms and some learners may not be able to use the multiple verb forms at the end of the unit at the same time as another group of learners. That's just the nature of L2 learning. When, what, and how I teach are also impacted by the learner's internal processing and understanding. So much of learning is not in my control, and that's something that we take into account as we plan our lessons and as we plan our teaching. So you might be wondering, why did we change the method? For one thing, we had a greater desire to speak, read, and write spontaneously because of globalization. So when there was a shift in economic means, there was really no reason just to translate large text. People actually had to do things in foreign languages. And also, in the 70s, they came up with new understanding of language learning. So we gave up on grammar translation. This was by the 30s. And the research found that in psychology, behavior and habit forming structures help learners learn. So they believed that the same rule would apply to language learning. Learners could listen, repeat, and memorize patterns in order to learn language. And people did learn languages doing translation or even listen and repeat. But their fluency or ability to interact naturally was hindered. So remember, with grammar translation, they focused on form, and learners were taught rules and patterns and words in their L1 and merely needed to write the meaning of a word or sentence through translation. So 3 things were happening during this time. No one needed to speak the language. Number 2, they needed to write words or sentences from L1 to L2. They didn't actually need to understand those sentences. And number 3, accuracy was super important, and they feared mistakes would be permanent, so they never allowed for any mistakes, which we've now understood that's impossible and you have to make mistakes in order to improve your language. The direct method followed grammar translation. So we didn't quite get directly to the audiolingual system until after the direct method. And it followed grammar translation, and it did allow for learner and teacher to interact in the foreign language, mainly with pictures and objects, and they introduced learning grammar through the inductive approach, which we still utilize today. So that was grammar translation. You had to explain first, and then you had to understand the pattern in your own language, and then you utilized the pattern in the new language. But in the inductive approach, you actually saw whole sentences and tried to figure out the pattern. So this was the inductive approach versus the deductive approach. So if they introduced this way of doing that where I could figure out the meaning of it. Since these methods were actually working, you may be wondering, why did we change the method? For one thing, by the 19th century, you're getting into serious globalized economy, and people actually needed to speak, read, write spontaneously in a foreign language. They could not just rely on their translation. And linguistics and SLA research informed new textbooks and new teaching styles. And we also created the functional notional syllabus by the time of the 70s, which completely transformed the way that we taught language. So we did give up on grammar translation. And we understood that there was more to it than just taking one chunk of words and then translating into another language, that there was more to understanding than this. They believed that behavior and habit forming structures help learners learn. So they believed that the same rule would apply to language learners. So this is audiolingualism. You could listen to the language and repeat, and then you would learn the language. People did learn languages at these times, but their fluency or ability to interact naturally was likely hindered, and there was some gap between how they naturally interacted with people. So we're also looking for a new way to improve spoken English in classrooms. So remember grammar translation, they taught the rules and the patterns in their L1 and merely needed to write the meaning of a sentence accurately. So you had number 1, there was no need to speak. And number 2, they just needed to write words or sentences from L1 to L2. And then finally, they only needed to have it accurate and perfect. The direct method followed grammar translation, and this allowed for learner and teacher to interact, mistakes to be made, and the foreign language to be used with pictures and objects. It was still very controlled, but less so than grammar translation, and it introduced the new style of learning grammar through the inductive approach. Grammar translation relied solely on explaining the pattern of language first and then memorizing the form, the deductive approach. But then they allowed for the inductive approach, where you can discover the pattern and understand the grammar in the particular context. So they could see like a pattern, I like apples, I like cheese, I like bananas, and then realize, oh, if I say I and like in an object, that's how it works. So they would understand it from that. This period ushered in a deep fear of L1 use in the classroom, though, and likely this was a reaction to the overuse of the L1 in the translation. So you do have this like very that's when people tell you you cannot use translators or other languages in the classroom, it will interrupt, when in fact we've learned that's probably not true. So audiolingualism came out of this era of this direct method. And by the 30s in the US, we were totally using it. And then it happened a little later, like in the 60s in many other parts of the world. So they believed that if you listen, repeat, and model, the reinforcement would produce accurate speech, which would be knowledge and meaning. Unfortunately, what happened is a lot of times people didn't even understand what they were saying. They were just listening and repeating just like a parrot, and they didn't actually know what they meant. So the good thing is that audiolingualism brought speech and L2 listening and speaking into the mainstream classroom. So we were emerging into this era of the communicative sense. And finally, by the 70s, the functional notional syllabus kind of sealed the deal, because they discovered that if you learned a language and you surrounded it around a function, something that you needed to do, and all the words and all the forms and all the structures that required you to do that, then students would have more meaning in what they were learning. So for instance, a unit on greetings, shopping, eating out, these types of things were functions or situations that required a varied set of grammar, vocabulary, and form, and that's what they focused on. So this type of syllabus and this type of approach helped with the communicative method, because that is what we still use today. What exactly is CLT? It's the communicative language teaching method, and it's not really even a method, it's an approach. And its basis premise is that we use language to communicate. Thus, in the classroom, you should produce real-life situations that require students to communicate. So the whole goal is that students will freely produce language at some point in the lesson. It stands out from the other methods because it attempts to focus the learning on communication rather than the study of language or form. So grammar translation just looked at the form. Audiolingual worked on the patterns and sounds. The notional functional approach did not allow for the freedom of form and meaning that CLT now emphasizes. So the emphasis in CLT was originally on what language is used for, communication and meaning, and not just how to use it correctly, the form. So the meaning-focused communicative task became an essential part of the classroom. The classroom may be set up as a cafe in order to teach greetings, food, and ordering food on a menu. So you're covering a whole myriad of things in one lesson, and it may go over a few weeks or a few days. So they looked at the classroom in a very different way. This created a real-life situation where rich language and expression would be required to complete the task, for instance, ordering food in a restaurant. However, it also created a huge problem for testing and how to teach to the test and how to teach reading and writing and how to cover grammar. So for many years, from kind of the late 70s into the 80s, when we were using this system, there was some confusion about how to cover the need for teaching accuracy, not just fluency. As you look at these 9 points, you'll see that there's some questions about the communicative language teaching, not so much in the United States where we have a lot of freedom in how we teach and why we teach, but more so when you go out into where the majority of English language learners are, which is in countries like China and India, Brazil, Germany, wherever they're learning English for a sole purpose of actually using it for work or school or things like that. So they're very limited in their classroom time, and then they don't have the English exposure outside of the classroom. So there's a few barriers to actually producing this type of communicative language teaching that we're talking about. But CLT is what every teacher says that they do today. Yet no one really knows what this involves and how communicative a classroom has to be in order to be a CLT class, but everybody says that's what they're doing. The point 1 that I made is certainly something believed in L2 learning today. People learn a language best when using it to do things rather than through studying how language works and practicing rules. So yes, CLT does not focus purely on the rules of the language and the structure, but it does teach rules and structure. So it's important to note that you do have to actually teach the rules and the form at some point. We can learn language by using it, but the problem is at what point do we teach form to produce accuracy in the CLT lesson? And people still really are uncertain about this. Number 2 is inaccurate. We also know that grammar has to be both explicitly, directly taught, and explained in order for learners to use vocabulary and language accurately. You cannot eliminate grammar from learning. And number 3 is true and a part of CLT. However, at some point, the class has to work on form and vocabulary, and that's not always fun. Also, people still need to work on tests and discrete testable parts of language in order to be assessed and graded. So it may not always be as interesting as they want it to be. And number 4, we know that errors need to be corrected, just not all the time. 5, it is listening and speaking heavy at times, and that is where it began at, because of the great big reaction to grammar translation and then the overuse of audiolingualism. So yes, most of the books have this heavy listening and speaking component, but we also have communicative reading text and we have communicative writing text. And there are real life language tasks that involve reading and writing. So it's not as if you cannot teach those forms using a communicative method. And number 6, yes, however, not at the expense of accuracy in form-focused lessons, which may not seem as communicative. So 6 is true, but the form and meaning of language both need to be taught at certain points to produce accurate language output. A part of this is fossilization, just the mere fact that you can't just allow students to continually make mistakes and have no intervention at all from a teacher. The teacher still has to intervene and teach accuracy. Number 7, dialogues are used as role play. They're never memorized, and the rules are student-centered and more appropriate for the actual learner's use and needs, so we usually adjust dialogues that are in text to include names of our students or information that would relate more to our students, and we may just write another alternative dialogue on the board that isn't in the textbook because we know this would interest our students more. So for instance, if you have a group of boys and it's talking about buying jewelry at a store, we don't actually have the boys talk about buying jewelry at a store. We change the topic to like boys buying, sports equipment at a store. We have the flexibility of that we use text, but we adjust them for our needs. So appropriacy and student-centeredness does take precedent. And number 8, yes, absolutely. Number 9, yes, but it is really a set of procedures, not a formula for learning. So I'm at no point in this class going to tell you this is how you teach. You have to use many different procedures, techniques, and methods in order to teach learners. That's really what we stand by in modern language teaching. Here are just a few of the things that CLT does look like. The course design is centered on the learner's needs, not the textbook or course materials. That's what you're keeping in mind. CLT course is flexible, fluid. It often changes as the course progresses with the learners, and it's often hard to accommodate this due to institutional, time, and cultural constraints that are very real. And so when you're out in another context outside of the United States, sometimes it's easy to judge the teachers to say, oh my gosh, why do they teach that way? It's likely because that is what works in the context that they're in and under this situation that they're in, and maybe for their own language level. So sometimes it helps to offer to go in and assist them or help them with an additional project or something that would be very hard for them to do, rather than judge the way that they're teaching, because there may be a reason for the way in which they're teaching. So although the grammar versus context, communicative competence argument kind of continues. What's more important, that they have accurate grammar or that they have an accurate communication and just fluently say something and we figure out what they mean? In the context of these sentences, I can tell with all of them that even with tonal differences, regardless of what they're saying, all of these sentences are understood to me. I have no doubt that they want the door open. In the first sentence, please to open's door, I may think the person is a doorman and enjoys opening doors if I just heard about it. However, if a person said this with their hands full in front of a closed door, I would open the door for them. So in every one of these sentences, my response to this will be to open the door for them. But what we can see is that if we don't teach accuracy, our students, if they were just taught grammar and memorization of structure, they may create these strange utterances. If we never corrected them, they would continue to make these strange utterances. And if we didn't teach context, pragmatics, tones, various things, they would never get to actual accurate speech, which we would all understand and say, oh yes, I would be happy to open the door for you, which is our overall aim. So these specific examples maybe don't make sense to you. Long dialogues, large amounts of vocabulary, decontextualized information, memorizing large amounts. Like, you might not be familiar with this, but these techniques are frequently used overseas in large classes. So in these large classes, they might have 50 students. And there's one L2 weak instructor. The instructor themselves has barely any opportunity to practice their English, and yet they're teaching English. And they have this major exam that they have to give at the end of the term, or they will lose their job. It's a very serious, high-stakes reality for these teachers. Or it just may be that they know that these things work and it makes a classroom roll and go smoothly and students feel like they're learning and engaging, even though we know these things are not very useful. So despite the fact that people are still using them, they really do not promote language and context. They are not learner-centered approaches, and they don't produce natural communication. So in this sense, these are not CLT methods. So people that are doing these and claiming that they're doing communicative teaching are not. They're still used by most instructors because they're easy to control, plan for, grade, and repeat. However, they do not lead to language fluency or confidence. So it's good if you're in a situation where you can help a teacher, you can guide them on how to change this ever so slightly. And when you see this in a textbook, you can also know how to adapt it so that it's not so kind of memorize heavy and useless. These are the things that we do emphasize in CLT when someone's talking about the communicative teaching. They really are learning a new form. You're providing time to practice the form in a controlled manner, and then the practice becomes freer, and then they do something on their own in a small group. And this builds that language fluency and confidence, and it also gives you the opportunity to assess whether or not they understood the new form and skill, and if they're using it correctly. So this system is not followed in order, but it is covering all of these types of discrete skills and information. Every 20 years, a method changes. You should know that the communicative language teaching has now turned into task-based teaching. So if you're really on the cutting edge, you do task-based teaching. And SL research has shown that language use equals language development. So the more that we have to use the language and the longer and more complex the task is, then the more likely that students will develop more language. So through these tasks, students use a modified inner language, which promotes acquisition. So because the aim overall is this very kind of efficient acquisition, if the classroom has the resources and the space and the opportunity to use these longer tasks, it's better than CLT alone. So a lot of teachers are actually transitioning where part of the unit they do communicative activities and practice language in a more controlled manner, and then they get a task on the same type of material where they have to go out and do it on their own. So a single project that allows students to work in small groups to complete a multi-part task with a presentable outcome, it's highly motivating and allows the learners to use all the language and knowledge they have at their disposal to complete a unique task, and you can grade the task. So it has many benefits for larger classrooms and everything. So for instance, like the interview activity, you can have them go and interview native speakers at a tourist site, and then they make these short films using their smartphones, and then they try out some of the idiomatic phrases that they learned through these interviews in their own dialogue, and they present all of this to the class. And then the class learns more language and interacts with one another and sees all the different things that they learned. Or they can create a sales pitch for a new product, complete with a presentation of the product to the whole class. There are so many options for tasks that can be shorter or longer, and they're even freer than a communicative task because basically you give them the task and they complete it using any language that they have at their disposal. And it's been shown that it produces even more authentic and expanded language by using this method. So a lot of people have turned away from communicative teaching and are now using task-based or project-based teaching. Task-based being kind of new, a lot of linguists actually don't agree on what a task is and what it looks like and how to do this. It's really not a method. It's definitely a procedure or approach. It's a technique. It's, it involves all the other methods. I mean, really, it's basically an expanded communicative task. The communicative task can usually be finished in one lesson. This requires outside time or a whole class period to devote to doing the project. So that's really the main difference. And I think we all know what a task is. But if you have trouble thinking about what a task is, you can look online at task-based lessons and you'll see all the different things that people have been using in classrooms, and particularly in the sense that a lot of teachers are now teaching content through the second language, and so they need these tasks in order to help the students work with really difficult like biological terminology or history or topics that are much more challenging and linguistically rich. So this way they have time to kind of process and expose themselves to this language in the time that it would take to finish the task. So for instance, I had my students that were in a science class, they had to do a project on Darwin, and each person was assigned a different part of Darwin to understand who he was and what his theories were and how it impacted the theory of evolution and the understanding of how species are changing. So it was this big thing, and it included going to the museum, and we did all kinds of things, and then they presented this, giving a presentation to their biology teacher, and then it helped them earn credit for biology because they couldn't actually read the biology text and complete the test and do the other things that the regular students were doing. So this gave them an additional opportunity to pass their biology class. Those are the reasons why task-based is really coming about. But there are many reasons to even do it overseas. It has a very beneficial side to it. The best way to understand a communicative language class is to watch one. And at the back of your book, your Harmer book, there's a DVD, or you can look on YouTube videos if you don't have that DVD, and just put in CLT lessons, ESL, like present progressive tense, and you'll see someone teaching the present progressive tense in a communicative way and what they're doing to cover that. And you'll see that the procedure and the process, the techniques and how it's structured and the resources that they use and the different games or activities they do, it varies completely. There's really no prescription. There's no way for me to say like, this is the order of a CLT lesson, because there's really no order. It should include a whole bunch of things. And if you look at page 58, chapter 4, he also gives a chart to show you kind of the continuum of how a communicative activity goes from being non-communicative to very communicative, and how you can expand an activity in that way. And that's really how we think about it. We take language and form and vocabulary, and then we see how can I expand this so the students are doing something on their own. And one of the tests that I have for it is if the answer is different for each student. That's communicative. If I ask them, what is your favorite color, red, blue, or green? I've taken away the communicative option versus what is your favorite color? And I just let them answer. And some people will say brown, and they can say anything you want, for instance. Or what is something that your mother always cooks for you when you have a cold? Everybody will have a different answer. So that's the kind of thing that I'm looking for in communicative. And they could write those answers. It doesn't mean that they have to speak them. So as you're looking at your lessons, that's where we're going to go next, is to say, okay, let's take a look at some lessons and see, are they communicative? And how can we make them more communicative? Why? Like, is there a good reason for it? Okay. As I've mentioned earlier, there are barriers to CLT's effectiveness. basically it comes down to what is the purpose of what you're teaching and where. And a lot of people, they just don't have the materials at their fingertips like we do in the United States, or they don't have the time to create the lessons, or they just don't understand how to do it well. So they revert back to older methods of teaching like lecture and teacher-led activities. And there's a lot of management issues with CLT. So there are many reasons why people are resisting it and not changing over to using CLT. And I think that's part of why they invite foreign experts, like different teachers, to come into their schools to teach, is because it's really easier for an outsider just to come in and do it. And we're not like changing our mind or changing our structure, or and we're not going to lose our job. Like there's no risk if I go in and teach a really creative, cool lesson in Mexico versus I know my friends there, that's their livelihood, that's their job. They have a lot more at stake than I do. So I kind of enjoy partnering with other teachers, and I encourage you, if you have the opportunity when you're overseas to do that, to try that out. Because typically they're not using communicative methods just because there's too many constraints. Also, there's a bit of a continuum of CLT. So if you look at in your own group, or if you work together, and we're going to do this a little bit when we're back in class together, if we look at the different tasks that you do, some things are more communicative, some things are less, but you have to do everything in the class. You can't just have, like, you can't just go in and say, talk about your day, and then that's it. Like, students still want you to teach them phrases and concepts and vocabulary and structures and forms so that they can do a better job talking about their day. So the continuum of how we do this really varies greatly, and also what is your purpose and what is your context? That will determine how communicative you're going to make something. So my hope is that we'll analyze our own lessons, that because you're doing your lesson 1 and you're turning it in, and then my additional hope is that I will have a couple lessons for you to look at, because I have a ton of lessons. So I'll just print out some lessons and say, okay, let's look at these. Are they communicative? How are they not? How are they so? This kind of thing. And just thinking about different methods and how we use them and how we structure lessons and how we order activities. That's really what communicative lessons are challenged in. Like, when do you present the communicative activity? When do you present the form? When do you go over the vocabulary? There's many different ways to do this, the deductive versus the inductive approach, the explicit versus the less explicit approaches that allow the learners to use language that you may not have even recognized that they would use. So when and how we present different things really varies. And then also we haven't even taken into account working with children, where their vocabulary and their ability to kind of manipulate language is limited in comparison to adults. So that's another factor that we haven't even begun to look at, but we will in this course. So I hope you enjoyed the communicative language teaching and methods introduction, and that you will comment on your reading response about methods and what you're thinking and what your philosophy is and how you're understanding it. You take care.